Yeah. Lords, I'm grateful to the noble Lord Adonis for introducing this measure, and I was struck by the metaphor with which he opened, that voting is the sheet anchor of democracy. Of course, a vessel needs a lot more than a sheet anchor. It needs bows and bridges and rigging and sails and bulwarks and all the rest of it. In other words, democracy to function relies on much more than a periodic right to mark a ballot paper. It relies on a series of norms and precedents. It relies on a measure of restraint from the winner, a measure of acceptance from the loser. It relies, above all, on both sides being prepared to accept the rules and not to alter them for partisan purposes. And I'm afraid that around the world we have seen a retreat from democracy as defined in that fuller sense. There's a number of organizations that measure it. There's Freedom House, there's the Democracy Index, there's the Economist Intelligence Unit and others, and they all tell a similar story, that after decades of improving democracy, at some point in the last 5 or 10 years, that progress stalled and began to go into reverse. Often in countries where there is still a vote, where people still have the franchise, but as in Venezuela or Russia or Iran, it's a meaningless vote because the other things that you need to sustain a democracy have been vitiated or lost. And we see this happening even in some of the oldest core democracies in the world. We've seen the deplorable way in the last couple of decades in which in the United States losers automatically go to law, automatically dispute the results, and indeed we saw just over a year ago the readiness of the losing candidate to go along with an attempt to prevent the validation of the vote. And it seems to me that when you have in that country built constitutionally on the idea of popular sovereignty, you have this unwillingness to accept votes that go against you, this readiness to treat democracy as contingent, then that is something that should alarm us here. And by the way, the kinds of people who were the first to condemn Trump were usually not equally ready to condemn the attempt to overturn the 2016 referendum in this country. But it's pretty much the same thing. You either believe in the process that all the sides have agreed in advance is going to be valid, or you don't. And the same hypocrisy, of course, applies the other way, right? The people who were most ready to condemn the democracy blockers here were willing to overlook some of Trump's excesses. And that, in a way, is the problem. In some ways, it's remarkable that we ever elevated process over outcome. It's an extraordinary thing, and may come to be seen as a blip, that the American electorate were more loyal to a desiccated piece of parchment hanging in the National Archives than to a real flesh-and-blood candidate. And yet, that readiness to accept the results, that readiness to elevate process over outcome is what makes for a free society. Now, are we then, when we look at this attempt to change the franchise here, are we confident that this is being done purely in a disinterested spirit as a way of strengthening our democracy? Or might we allow the possibility that it is being advanced in some quarters, again, as an outcome-led measure, that people assume that 16 and 17-year-olds will vote in a particular way, and they reason backwards from that conclusion and come up with all sorts of more general arguments for it? Can we confidently say that the extension of the franchise, first in Scotland and then in Wales, to 16-year-olds was wholly divorced from any consideration of how they might vote either in referendums or in general elections? Can we, as we look at the rolls in your Lordship's chamber, when we discuss the measure that Lord Renard just mentioned to extend the franchise to 16-year-olds in the EU referendum, can we confidently say that those who were voting for the extension of the franchise had no particular vested interest in how that vote would go, that this was just a sheer coincidence that they happened to have put those two issues together? Well, I can't definitively answer that question, my lords. You know, we all have our own motives, we all have our own principles, and I'm not peering into other peers' souls. Let me simply make this observation. The first time that I stood here on a Friday, the first of these debates that I participated in last year, happened to be on a measure about the legal age at which you were allowed to take Botox as a treatment. And unlike today, when I'm, as usual on a Friday, in a minority of one or two, there was actually an extraordinary consensus on all sides. I think every single speaker argued that it was right to raise the age of consent for Botox from 16 to 18. Now, that was the message that came from the crossbenchers, from the Liberal Democrats, from Labour, and from the Conservatives. And we heard all sorts of arguments, including one or two from peers who are present today, about how this was consistent, because we treated 18 as the age of consent in almost every other regard. And peer after peer stood up to explain that 18 was the age at which you could get a mortgage, or buy a bottle of wine, or get a tattoo, or buy a knife. And one after another, people said, yes, absolutely right, there's such a thing as an age of maturity, and if we've decided that 18 is that age, then we must end these loopholes on things like Botox, tattoos, and so on. Well, okay, fine. If that's as a country, if that's what we decide is the age of maturity, are we seriously going to argue that 16 and 17-year-olds should be prohibited from doing all of those things, but should have the right to vote on whether everyone else is allowed to do those things? Are you seriously confident that that will be seen as a purely disinterested measure without any partisan calculation behind it? My lords, I suggest that one way to encourage turnout and to tackle the cynicism of some of our voters is visibly to stop playing partisan games with the franchise.
My lords,